Hi, and welcome back to Platonic Soul. Today, a true story of snark in the ivory tower. At issue, a seemingly abstract point that you might find in the end relates to your life in the most basic way. In November 1963, a book review appeared in the German Journal of Classical Studies, Gnomon. The review was written by Gregory Vlastos, a professor of ancient philosophy at Princeton. Vlastos was reviewing a book that had been published 4 years earlier, written by a scholar at Germany's University of Tübingen, Hans Joachim Kramer, called Virtue in Plato and Aristotle, on the nature and history of Platonic ontology. Vlastos, considered by English-speaking academics at least, one of the 20th century's greatest scholars of Plato, was remarkably unsparing. His review opened with an apology that the relatively brief space allowed for it would allow him to refute only a few of Kramer's astonishing claims. He wrote, "Even a bare summary of everything of importance in this book, or more precisely, of everything that would be important if it were true, would have required many times the space allowable for the whole of this review." It's pretty clear that Vlastos agreed with few of these would-be important claims. Kramer, he wrote, suffered from muddled thinking. He would have interpreted Plato otherwise if he were, quote, clear-headed as to consequences of his own views, unquote. The German scholar repeatedly misreads the dialogues. Vlastos concludes, quote, with disastrous consequences for the interpretation of Plato's thought, unquote. Kramer's interpretation, he wrote in a later review, was a, quote, grandiose construction, unquote. This was in 1981. Quote, a work of the imagination whose claim to sober truth is minimal, unquote. Vlastos was certainly not alone in his criticism of Kramer's work, which argued for a radical rethinking of Plato. But Kramer would not be alone either. In the decades that followed the publication of his first book, he and two other professors at the same university, Tübingen, followed up with books and articles making similar arguments for a rethinking of Plato, and in doing so, fueled a controversy of rare intensity in the academic world, one unusually given to ad hominem attacks. In a 1983 article, Kramer came back with personal attacks of his own. Scholars, he said, had poorly evaluated the theory he and his colleagues advanced, sometimes willfully. Their criticism, he said, quote, is based not so much on arguments, but rather, either, as in the case of philologists, on a philosophical incompetence, or, as happens in the case of philosophical opponents, on a denial which is against what they themselves know well, and is therefore in bad faith. This denial of the Tübingen interpretation, Kramer wrote, has its ultimate causes in accidents of a biographical nature of the various scholars, and in gaps pertaining to their spiritual formation. Now, Kramer was actually writing in Italian here, or the piece that he wrote as it was published had been translated into Italian, and the word he uses is spirituale. But it is possible that the German word he had in mind is geistig, which could also mean mental or intellectual. So he could be talking about, it's conceivable, this is just me thinking, it's conceivable he meant spiritual, but he maybe could also have meant mental or intellectual formation. But anyway, he doesn't think these people had it all together upstairs. And also feeling, he says, it's coming also, he said, out of feelings of rivalry. So what was all the fuss about? Well, it turns out It's pretty intimately related to the journey Diotima sent us on in the symposium, you may remember, several episodes back, actually. When Plato says through Diotima that all human desire is for the good, we realized we needed to find out what Plato actually meant by the good. In the Republic, he calls it the principle of everything, but doesn't explain why. So I talked about there seeming to be four basic ways that scholars have come up with to try to explain what his thinking may have been here. But I left out the fourth one, other than to mention that the great American classical scholar Paul Shorey had dismissed it as, quote, quite irrelevant, unquote. Well, the fourth interpretation is that Plato understood by the good something he called the one, by which he means being in its unity, being as one, as opposed to being how we normally think of it, really, as an infinite number of objects and moments. This is a concept that really, I think, stretches the capacity of the everyday human mind. I mean, it's in that everyday human mind that we see being as this infinite number of objects and moments. And it's to see everything in its oneness is what we would normally associate with something, with a mystical state. And though, as we mentioned, we can't find this or any of the other four proposed interpretations anywhere in an explicit way in Plato's dialogues, the Tübingen scholars argued that a significant amount of evidence found elsewhere, and I'll get into that later, adds up to strongly suggest not only that this was Plato's teaching, but that it in fact, that the good was the one, but that it in fact underlies his entire philosophy. Similar theories had been put forth before, but never with the level of depth and detail that the Tübingen scholars went into. None of the original three proponents of the Tübingen interpretation are alive today. The youngest of them, Thomas Slezak, died in 2023. But their theory has continued to attract adherents, and so neither the debate nor the vitriol that tends to accompany it have ended. In a 1984 book on Plato, published in Italian in 1984 and in English, I believe, in the early 90s. Italian scholar Giovanni Reale basically carries out an intellectual vendetta against opponents of the Tübingen understanding of Plato. His book opens with a chapter devoted to explaining the characteristics of paradigm shifts according to Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions, so that the reader will be able to recognize these signs in the Tübingen interpretation. And that includes, of course, one assumes, in his own book. In this light, the rise of the Tübingen school comes to have, for Reale, something of the historically inevitable about it, and its victory triumphant. The traditional interpretation, Reale writes, is, quote, exploded, unquote, by the new teaching. Because Kuhn also describes what resistance to scientific revolutions tends to look like, Reale's book can make the opponents of the new paradigm come off as the pawns of history, just sort of unknowingly following this role that's been set out for them, this pattern. Great resistance is only to be expected where a great transformation is afoot. The weakness of their positions has forced them to desperate measures typical of scientific reactionaries. They have, quote, pulled and twisted, unquote, Plato's words, and tried to, quote, eliminate the counter-evidence, unquote, to try to save the old paradigm and spare its adherents the, quote, psychological and social consequences, unquote, that inevitably face turf-defending advocates of, quote, obsolete, unquote, theories. But their struggles are proving increasingly futile. The, quote, last-ditch defenses of it, unquote, he writes, are no longer achieving their desired effect. Well, some would beg to differ with that, and in a 2006 paper, Columbia professor Wolfgang Rainer Mahn renewed the assault on the Tübingen school, which he refers to as a, quote, fringe phenomenon, unquote. Gregory Vlastos, Mann wrote, had, if anything, been too lenient. The Tübingen scholars read Plato's dialogue in a, quote, perverse, unquote, way. Near the end of this essay, he writes, quote, why did such an unpromising direction of research, now I have to laugh at the quotation marks he put and the journal published around the word research. Why did such an unpromising direction of research get off the ground in the first place? And how is it possible that the Tübingen project has been sustained for so long? Unquote. So, what to make of these decades of rancor in the academy? What was it about this theory that provoked such testiness? I think there are actually a number of factors at play here, which I'd like to explore later in this series. But first, I'd like to delve a bit more deeply into the evidence that the Tübingen scholars brought in support of their position. Evidence for, as they saw it anyway, evidence for what's become known as the esoteric teaching of Plato, or the unwritten doctrines. Evidence that, if you're not already familiar with it, might surprise you. And you might then find that has you asking interesting questions, not just about Plato, but maybe even about your own life. Anyway, that's what I'll be talking about later in this series. Until then, thanks for watching.